Hello, this is Jason Matthews. I'm a retired law enforcement officer, and today I'm going to be answering the question, are correctional officers law enforcement? And I'm going to be answering this question because there's a lot of confusion out there about this subject and a lot of misconceptions. But before we get started, if you support the police and law enforcement, click the like button. If you do not support the police or law enforcement, click the dislike button. It's anonymous. And I'm just curious of where you stand because I see a lot of divisiveness out there in the news, in social media. So let your voice be heard. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Coming out of the military, my first job was as a correctional officer. So I have personal experience here. And I can say with certainty that being a correctional officer, at least when I was a correctional officer, it was no joke. Coming out of the military as a combat veteran, going into a maximum security prison with criminals of all sorts, being under constant danger the entire shift, with things happening all day, every day, I can say as a general principle that I consider correctional officers as law enforcement. Now, I'm going to get into some of the details because there are some legal issues here that determine whether correctional officers are, in fact, law enforcement officers, because I have my personal opinion, but then I also have the direction of the law, which says correctional officers are law enforcement officers. Now, as you see in this video, this is the Bureau of Prisons, and I worked for the Bureau of Prisons. And as a matter of fact, I worked in a prison called USP Lompoc, United States Penitentiary Lompoc. My understanding now is that it is no longer a maximum security prison, but when I worked there, it was in fact a maximum security prison and one of the toughest, most renowned maximum security prisons in the United States. And as a matter of fact, USP Lompoc was called the New Rock. The old Rock was Alcatraz. So this took the place of Alcatraz. Now, if you've ever been to Alcatraz, you can look it up if you haven't been there or if you have not visited. You can look up what Alcatraz looked like inside and outside, and USP Lompoc looked very, very similar. This was really old school. It was a very old prison. It was an old military prison. I believe both were military prisons. I could be wrong. I'd have to look up Alcatraz, but if I remember correctly, it was also a military prison before it was a civilian prison. But very few things when I worked in USP Lompoc were electronically controlled. You had the front gate was electronically controlled, and what we call the front sally port, which is the main entrance in or out, was also electronically controlled by the control center. However, everything else in that prison was key controlled. But you had the key or you didn't have the key. This was really old school, and it was no joke. There were convicted criminals in USP Lompoc, and they were convicted of many types of different crimes. For example, a lot of bank robbers, armed bank robbers. We had Al-Qaeda in there. This is before 9/11. These were the Al-Qaeda that were a part of the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. There were murderers, rapists, any type of crime that you can think of, any type of violent crime you can think of. These people were in USP Lompoc. Now, there was also a camp that was across the street from the maximum security prison, and sometimes I would work there on a rare occasion, maybe once or twice a year for one shift. And that's a whole different animal, and I'll talk about that here briefly. But I will say that as a correctional officer working in a maximum security prison, I can say your life is on the line every second of that shift. Whereas a law enforcement officer outside of the prison, a regular law enforcement officer who works the streets, is not constantly in danger all shift. In USP Lompoc, there would be what we would call institutional disturbances, which could be small or big. Basically, it could be anything from someone stabbing someone to an all-out riot, things were happening like that every single day. So we would run to break up people stabbing each other or fighting each other, I would say almost every single day, if not multiple times a day. Yeah, there were some days where it didn't happen, but then there were some days where it happened multiple times. And me, as a combat veteran coming out of the military, I felt more unsafe in a maximum security prison, especially when things were happening, riots and such, than I did when I was in the military overseas. So this is serious business. Now, the lower levels, which I have no experience with, which in the Bureau of Prisons, there were maximum security, high level, medium level, low level, and then the camps. The camps were minimum security. Camps were open. They were like the people who committed tax fraud or something like that. And they could just walk away if they wanted to. Now, they had incentives to not walk away because they would get more added onto their sentence, and they would go behind the fence to a higher security level if they were to walk away and be caught. And I worked at another maximum security prison also that was newer in my time as a correctional officer. So based on my personal experience, I will absolutely say that correctional officers in the Bureau of Prisons specifically are law enforcement officers. And not only that, not only my opinion, legally speaking, they are law enforcement officers because they get law enforcement retirement and law enforcement pay. And why is that? First of all, they deserve it way more than law enforcement on the outside, generally speaking, because of the dangers they are put in. Also, law enforcement officers in the Bureau of Prisons have authority, law enforcement authority, outside of the prison, depending on the circumstance, because many times correctional officers will take prisoners outside of the gate to local medical facilities for treatment, and they are armed. There are, at least when I was there, you had 3 armed correctional officers and 1 lieutenant for that one maximum security inmate. And so if something were to happen outside of the prison, a law enforcement officer, a correctional officer, could arrest someone for trying to interfere with that inmate or something related to that. Additionally, correctional officers in the Bureau of Prisons have law enforcement authority on site, on the prison site and the surrounding land. If it's owned by the Bureau of Prisons, the federal government, they can arrest people on that land. So on outside mobile patrol, which is basically you are roaming around the perimeter in a vehicle, making sure no one's trying to penetrate that perimeter. You're also doing traffic stops on vehicles, just like you would outside of a prison as a regular law enforcement officer. You're doing traffic stops on vehicles, and you have the authority to take law enforcement action for whatever is at hand in those circumstances. Many times, contraband is found on these traffic stops, people with warrants, and many other incidents. Additionally, visitors come to visit these inmates. The public comes into the prisons to visit inmates, and they try to bring in drugs. And they can be arrested by these correctional officers for bringing in drugs. They can be detained, they can be searched for contraband, and law enforcement violations can be taken against them. Now, I don't know every state and every jurisdiction, but I can say that in some states, correctional officers are considered peace officers with full law enforcement authority also. Now, my understanding is in some states, they are not considered law enforcement officers, which is very unfortunate. I personally would break it down among the security levels, because if you're in maximum security in any state, I'm going to say you're doing law enforcement actions on a regular and reoccurring basis. You are searching inmates. You are obtaining contraband. In other words, contraband is illegal items. Those inmates can be prosecuted for crimes even though they are already in prison. They're prosecuted for new crimes. Now, normally that is handled through disciplinary administrative channels. In other words, they are punished But in other circumstances, if it's serious enough, if they stab an inmate or they kill someone or whatever, they will be re-prosecuted through the court system, and additional years are added onto their sentence, and they're convicted of a new crime. So just like out on the streets, if you apprehend someone for committing crimes, the same thing is true for correctional officers inside of a prison. They are arresting people for new crimes, and they have law enforcement authority to do so. Now, me personally, legally, I would probably break it down to determine if you are a law enforcement officer in prison as a correctional officer. I would break it down by security levels, because if you're at a camp or a low security prison, yeah, you're not doing all the things that a correctional officer is doing at a maximum security level. I would have to go in and determine who would get law enforcement pay, who would be recognized as a peace officer, who would be recognized as a law enforcement officer based on their duties, because the duties are different at different levels. It's much easier at the lower levels than it is at the higher levels. And that's just the reality. I'm not trying to diminish anyone's service at the lower levels, but this is just the reality. You're doing more of babysitting at the camp level. So in many circumstances, the law enforcement officers, the correctional officers inside of the prison are doing way more than the law enforcement out on the streets. When I was in maximum security, I would constantly be talking to inmates, walking around the cell block, walking around the prison, getting intelligence, just like I would as a law enforcement officer on the outside, trying to get intelligence, document that, and then take action on that intelligence. There's a lot more going on inside, especially a maximum security prison, than the public believes. Everything is ran by gangs. Everything. You will be a member of a gang. You have no choice in maximum security. And it's all divided down by the races. This is serious business, people. There are rules for everything made by the gangs in prison. There is an excessive amount of drugs in prisons. So my time actually as a correctional officer in maximum security was one of my favorite times of my career, even though it was dangerous. It was high adrenaline. It was rewarding. And if you're a maximum security correctional officer, I'm just going to say it right now, you're a badass, because you're putting up with a lot of crap. Also, you are exposed to a lot of violence. You are also breaking up fights all the time, using force on inmates constantly removing inmates by force on what we call cell extractions. What this is, for example, if someone does not want to eat, a prisoner does not want to eat, or if they are threatening suicide, or if they have thrown something out of the cell and hit an officer, for example, a cell extraction team is formed. You suit up in gear, protective gear, helmets, and protective clothing, and you go in by force, and you more than likely are going to be fighting that inmate, because they're going to be fighting that team, of that extraction team. They could have weapons. Now, how can someone have weapons in prison? I'll probably cover this in future videos because it's too much of a in-depth subject for me to cover. I will probably cover race, because race governs everything in maximum security. We're talking about black, white, Hispanic, and such. A lot of the public has no clue about this, how force is used by correctional officers and such in future videos, so stay tuned for that. But being a correctional officer in maximum security is extremely rewarding because there's so much going on all the time. I remember sometimes during night shift, which usually is from 4 p.m. to midnight, this is when most of the activity happens. Why is that? Because there's less officers in prison during this time. Because during the day shift is when all the admin people are there. There's a higher level of correctional officers present. And so the night shift is when there's less people available to respond. And that's a cue for the gangs to do their business. This is when most of the activity happens. But in the future, I will go more into depth and give more detail about my experience as a correctional officer and how everything works in the prison and the rules And so my definitive answer, in my opinion, especially correctional officers at the maximum security level, are definitely, and I actually believe that in order to be a law enforcement officer on the street, it should be mandatory that you work in a prison or in a jail first. And in many sheriff's departments, for example, this is a requirement that you work a certain amount of time in the jail, and then you have the opportunity to work on the streets. That gives you a lot of experience dealing with hardened criminals, which you need on the streets. Otherwise, you're going to be taken advantage of, and you're going to have a lot harder time doing your job and learning how to deal with hardened criminals on the streets. And it just gives you a matter-of-fact way of dealing with people and seeing through all the crap and all the nonsense that law violators will give you out on the streets. You can see through the BS immediately based on what you saw in jail or prison. You also know how to protect yourself better because you are protecting yourself, doing use of force nearly on a daily basis in prison. And that translates over to the streets. You feel a lot more confident out on the streets that you can handle certain circumstances that you may encounter on the streets. And you're more likely to go hands-on with people on the streets when you need to do so. Whereas I've seen many law enforcement officers who have never had correctional experience, they're hesitant to go hands-on when they should go hands-on. And when I say hands-on, I mean put hands on people and use force when applicable and when necessary. So I hope this answers the question for you. Are correctional officers law enforcement officers? And I will go into much more detail in future live streams and videos that I have planned about my history and my experience and my feelings and observations about being a correctional officer. If you enjoyed this video, click the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to be notified when new videos are released. Take care and have a great day.